Good evening. The trade war between the world's two biggest economies, the US and China, has intensified, with President Trump imposing a swathe of new tariffs on thousands of Chinese products. He's insisting that doubling import taxes will make America much stronger. Well, the tariffs affect more than $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, including consumer goods like furniture, car parts and handbags, all shipped to America. Now, the US had already levied a 10% tariff on Chinese goods last September, but today that rose to 25%, and Beijing has vowed to retaliate. Tonight, Mr. Trump maintained his relationship with China's President Xi is very strong, but a trade deal seems far off. Well, we'll be live in Beijing, but first to our North America editor, John Sopel, who's in Washington for us tonight. John.
Clive, these crucial talks started this morning. They were over by lunchtime. There was no agreement, and it's unclear when or if they will resume. And in fact, there is brinkmanship on both sides. The US calculation is that a prolonged trade war will hurt China far more than it will the United States. The Chinese calculation is that Donald Trump has an electoral cycle to worry about, and he won't want to be going into an election with a weakened economy. For the moment, neither side is blinking. A bell can signify celebration, but it also can ring out a warning. And today it felt like the latter, after Donald Trump imposed much higher tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the US and fired out a warning to the world's second biggest economy that he's digging in for the long haul. He tweeted, "Talks with China continue in a very congenial manner. There's absolutely no need to rush, as tariffs are now being paid to the United States by China of 25% on $250 billion worth of goods and products." The Chinese are in Washington in the hope of concluding a deal. Their lead negotiator said increasing tariffs hurts everyone.
I came here in these special circumstances with sincerity and to engage in rational, candid exchanges with the US side. Of course, China believes raising tariffs is not a solution to this problem. It will be harmful for China, the United States, and the entire world.
Donald Trump has often been accused of being too trigger-happy when it comes to tariffs, too keen to start a trade war. But on this, significantly, the Democrats are behind him. They're urging him to remain tough. When it comes to trade and China, there's a feeling here that they've been allowed to get away with too much for too long. The talks have broken up for the time being without agreement, the Treasury Secretary sounding decidedly guarded about how they'd gone.
They were constructive discussions between both parties. That's all we're going to say. Thank you.
This factory in the south of China makes Wi-Fi routers, millions of them, many earmarked for the US market. But now with new tariffs, those sales are in doubt. TP-Link, like everyone else around the world, thought that a deal was imminent, that the two sides would bridge their differences. But last weekend, the US president accused Beijing of ratting on the deal to open up the Chinese economy to US goods. In the middle of this are US farmers whose products have been hit by retaliatory tariffs, and they're desperate for a trade deal as soon as possible.
We've almost waited too long. So the only thing that's really going to help us is if he makes a deal and China comes in and they guarantee to buy X amount of bushels.
And US consumers who are now going to find a range of imports costing way more in the shops. And if this carries on, it'll be the global economy that will suffer. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Good evening. Say what you like about him, Donald Trump is an expert at stirring up confrontation. And tonight he's taken on the world's most populous nation, raising tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese imports. Beijing has yet to respond with tariffs of its own, but the government there has said it will retaliate, risking a trade war that could, of course, damage the global economy. High-level talks in Washington have failed to reach a breakthrough tonight, sending the US markets down. But the president insists there's no need to rush the negotiations. He claims the tariffs will make America stronger. Just sit back and watch, he said.
The soybean fields of Maryland feel a long way from the stuffy negotiating rooms where trade deals are won and lost. But it's in places like this that the real impact of trade wars and tariffs are felt. By farmers like David Burrier, who's seeing his soybean business decimated by the dispute with China. So this tariff situation has an immediate impact on you?
Absolutely, yes. It has depressed the price of beans substantially.
And I guess that changes the way that you plan your future, your
Absolutely.
present, everything.
What happens is it affected our cash flow. We don't have the dollars to work with that we usually do. So.
David and his wife Linda continually monitor the bean prices.
1.6 cents.
They were once $17 a bushel. Now they're less than 8.
The market's down again. This tariff thing, it's like it's almost day to day, and then we get disappointed, so then the market reacts down.
They accept that tariffs have worked in reducing the trade deficit with China, one of the president's aims. Unfortunately for them, the Chinese are the biggest importers of soybeans.
Well, our income last year was cut in half, and so it makes it pretty tough on trying to get all of our bills paid now, let alone that's last year's bills we're trying to catch up on and we're behind.
The president says additional support will be offered to farmers and has repeatedly tweeted about how good increased tariffs will be for the country. Tariffs will bring in far more wealth to our country than even a phenomenal deal of the traditional kind, he said. Also, much easier and quicker to do. Our farmers will do better, faster, and starving nations can now be helped. Waivers on some products will be granted or go to new source. The tariffs on imports from China will rise from 10% to 25%. China will retaliate with similar penalties. But where earlier rises were weathered by manufacturers and retailers, now it's likely to be the consumer who will pick up the bill.
If this is really simply about the bilateral trade deficit with China, yes, it works. If it is about making life easier for U.S. low-income families, for U.S. farmers, for U.S. manufacturing, no, this is not the way to go, especially not in the long term.
The final day of talks aimed at finding a lasting solution is now over. But the handshakes are not to seal any deal. The conversations will go on, with both sides aware this situation has the potential to be economically damaging to both nations and the global economy. Emma Murphy, News at 10, Washington, D.C.
OK, we'll go back and chat to Emma in just a moment. But first, I want to speak to Debbie, who is in Beijing. Debbie, how are the Chinese really likely to respond to this?
Well, these tariffs are hurting here and they will continue to hurt, but perhaps not to the extent that Donald Trump had anticipated. The biggest losers here are these small to medium-sized enterprises, and there is a real threat of these tariffs driving out manufacturers to Thailand, to Vietnam, to South Korea. But to a large extent that was already happening as China pivots away from being a manufacturing industry to a service industry. But China has said from the beginning that it is in this for the long haul. It has the resources, it has its massive population to weather this storm. But perhaps what the Chinese had underestimated was President Trump's resolve in this trade war. And what the past few days have shown us is that they are still struggling to deal with him, to deal with his temperament, his very public broadsides. The Chinese have said they will retaliate to these tariffs, but you will continue to see from them a very measured tone.
OK, Debbie, thank you very much. Well, as I said, let's go back to Emma. Emma, is the sense that the Americans are behind the president on this, or do they think he's gone too far?
Well, it's interesting because at the moment, America and Washington feels extremely divided. There seems to be a real split whether people are with President Trump or against him. But he's had bipartisan support on this matter because there is a feeling, certainly with members of the House and the Senate, that America is not being treated fairly by China in the way that trade deals are done. And that is why a firm position is needed to be taken. So, yes, there has actually been support for him in taking this position with tariffs. But what will be telling is what happens in the longer term, because this is seen as okay as a short-term option, but it's not really sustainable, because although it will bring the deficit down, as it has done already, it will start to really impact on American businesses and American consumers. One estimate is that at least $900 a year, so just to a family of 4, that's going to have an impact. So he is going to have to find a long-term solution, or he will lose that support.
OK, Emma in Washington and indeed Debbie in Beijing. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, good evening. It's a game of high-stakes brinkmanship paid by the leaders of the world's two biggest economies. The United States and China are now engaged in a trade war after President Trump more than doubled tariffs on £150 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China said it would retaliate. And the impacts will be felt across the globe. The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, told Sky News it could prompt a worldwide slowdown that will be dangerous for the UK economy. Well, in a moment, we'll hear from our business correspondent, Adam Parsons, on the implications for the UK. But first, I'm joined by our US correspondent, Cordelia Lynch. So, Cordelia, Donald Trump has said today that he's in no rush to finalise a trade agreement with China. So what's the significance of this ongoing row?
Well, talks have ended today without a deal, and I think what that represents is that Donald Trump is very serious at trying to pressure Beijing to try and come to the table and be willing to commit to some key points that he and his administration have long asked for. They include protecting American intellectual property and China being willing to buy more American products, because at the moment America imports 5 times more products from Beijing than Beijing does from America. So there is a clear inequality there, and I think we've seen the president irked by Beijing. He believes that they've reneged on some of the key points in their negotiations, because just a couple of weeks ago it was looking quite positive, like they might be able to reach some kind of agreement. Not so now, and Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, when he was asked what next, he said, well, there's no plans for future talks yet, but they do have some time to try and look at this, and there is a consensus that it could be months before consumers feel any pinch with these tariffs. And Donald Trump sounds at the moment like he's still got room for manoeuvre. He's just tweeted, I'll share that with you, where he has fairly optimistic words, where he says, over the course of the past 2 days, the United States and China have held candid and constructive conversations on the status of the trade relationship between both countries. The relationship between President Xi and myself remains a very strong one, and conversations into the future will continue. In the meantime, the United States has imposed tariffs on China, which may or may not be removed, depending on what happens with respect to future negotiations. So definitely dangling the sense that they could still broker an agreement. In the meantime, you speak to some analysts who say that Beijing might ultimately try and take the moral high ground with this, that they have the more vulnerable economy, and that Donald Trump may actually be able to carve a bit of a victory here, because after all, he said back in 2016, promised his voters that he would try and reset the dynamic between the two nations when it comes to their trade, and he'll want to try and deliver on that if he can. There's talk, though, about those consumers that might have to pick up the extra prices, of course. Those, for instance, that are buying car parts, or perhaps as well small tech. So there are issues that they could be facing, but Donald Trump wants to be seen to be consistent on this, wants to take a strong line, and I think that's what we're seeing today.
Cordelia, thank you.